Hello, thanks for tuning in. Before I start, I'd like to mention that you can find a brief handout for the presentation below the video. In this talk, I'll give an account of Nietzsche's conception of valuing that builds on 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗀𝗂𝗂𝗏 2016 account. I answer the descriptive question of what it means for someone to value something, rather than the normative question of whether what someone values is in fact valuable. 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏 argues that an agent values X if and only if the agent 1 has a drive-induced positive affective orientation toward X, and 2 does not disapprove of this affective orientation. I object to condition 2 by showing that Nietzsche thinks we can disapprove of our values and still count as holding them. On my view, an agent values the aim of one of their drives when the drive is strong enough to generate an abiding, positive affective orientation toward its aim. I argue that my view can address the problem I identify in 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏's account, in addition to two problems that he identifies in John Richardson's account and Maud-Marie Clark in David Dudrick's account. My account of valuing contains two key terms, drive and affective orientation. I'll start by defining these key terms before moving on to my criticism of 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏's account. I'll begin with drives. Dispositional accounts of the drives are the most common, and I'll work with a dispositional account in what follows. Building on 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏's discussion, I propose 4 criteria for the kind of disposition that counts as a drive. First, drives are relatively stable dispositions that induce affective orientations. Second, they aim at a characteristic pattern of activity and achieve expression of their aims through an object. For example, my drive to eat aims at the activity of eating and can be satisfied by hitting upon objects such as sandwiches or apples. Third, drives can alter the agent's experience in such a way that the agent is inclined to seek out objects that allow the drives to express themselves. For example, my drive to eat will make things that are likely to satisfy the drive stand out. It might do so by causing me to have desires to go to particular restaurants or cook certain meals, and generally, by making objects pertinent to the aim of eating salient to me. Finally, drives are largely outside of our rational control. I cannot develop a new drive simply by adopting new habits or patterns of behavior. Rather, the drives that we happen to have is to a large degree not up to us. Affective orientations, on the other hand, are complex states comprised of affectively charged thoughts and perceptions. They're constituted by a range of attractions, emotions, perceptual saliences, and behavioral dispositions. These various parts mutually reinforce one another because they're directed at a common aim, namely the aim of the drive inducing the relevant affective orientation. Now I'll turn to my criticism of 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏 and use it to formulate my own view. 𝗏𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏 introduces condition 2, which I will also call the disapproval condition, in order to avoid a view on which we value the aims of all of our drives. He identifies this problem in John Richardson's account. To see how the disapproval condition works, consider the case of an alcoholic who recognizes that they have a drive to drink alcohol, but who nevertheless regrets their behavior and consciously disvalues drinking alcohol. Despite the alcoholics having a positive, drive-induced affective orientation towards drinking, it's unintuitive to say that they value drinking. In order to accommodate this case, 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏 claims that the alcoholic does not value drinking because they disapprove of the drive's aim. The alcoholic doesn't satisfy condition 2, the disapproval condition. Disapproval for 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏 can take a variety of forms. He says that it can be manifest in explicit judgments, or more modestly, it can be a feeling of aversion, doubt, conflict, or dissatisfaction with one's attitude toward X. So, for 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏, in order to not value something, it's enough merely to feel conflicted or uneasy about it. The main problem for condition 2 arises because 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗏's formulation doesn't capture Nietzsche's thought that an individual can have intense feelings of disapproval and conscious thoughts of disapproval toward their values and still count as holding those values. Nietzsche describes the individual as a, quote, battleground for conflicting values, and many passages in Nietzsche trade on the fact that we often have ambiguous and conflicting feelings about our values. I've copied some relevant passages below on the handout. For Nietzsche, it seems disapproval, even of the strongest variety, is insufficient to constitute a disvalue. If this is so, then when does Nietzsche think we stop valuing something? In other words, if disapproval cannot stop some of our drive's aims from counting as values, is it the case that Nietzsche thinks we value the aims of all of our drives? I argue that this is not the case, but that Nietzsche's answer has some unintuitive implications. For Nietzsche, we value the aims of drives that can generate strong, positive, affective orientations toward their aims. Strong affective orientations have a tight network of mutually reinforcing affects, perceptions, and propensities. For example, a strong drive for aggression makes one see the world such that aggressive behavior seems warranted. The drive could lead me to interpret another's benign behavior as a personal snub, their respectful silence as indifference, or their attentive concern as intrusiveness. In each case, I'm encouraged to think that aggressive activity is warranted when in fact it is not. The drive for aggression can also help me latch on to features of the world that might genuinely warrant aggression, say a tiger mid-pounce or an opposing boxer's grimace. Drives can prime an agent to respond appropriately to their environment. In this way, drives are capable of, as Nietzsche says, coloring, gilding, lighting, or staining experience by making certain features of the world stand out. Drives generate a network of affects, propensities, and patterns of behavior that reinforce one another and are centered on a common aim. The more developed the network, the stronger the affective orientation. A drive counts as strong when it can generate affective orientations of this kind, and the strength of a drive corresponds to the strength of the affective orientation it can generate. I argue that one ceases to value a drive's aim when this mutually reinforcing network breaks down, when one's perception is no longer directed in the appropriate ways, and when the affective network begins to degenerate into a host of fleeting and discrete affects. The relevant drive can at best only generate mere likings. When a drive no longer commands influence over the course of one's life and the shape of one's character, because it can no longer induce strong affective orientations like the one described above, one ceases to value the drive's aim. Thus, on my view, valuing a drive's aim involves nothing over and above having a strong positive affective orientation toward that aim. This account has two important implications, the first of which is rather unintuitive. Nevertheless, I argue that it's still Nietzsche's view. The first implication is that I cannot disvalue the aims of strong drives that generate abiding affective orientations. While this sounds strange, it does help to avoid over-intellectualizing Nietzsche's position. Clarke and Dudrick are open to this charge because they argue that in order to value something, one must have a positive affect toward it that one regards as justified. Thus, valuing requires reflecting on the justificatory status of one's affects. This is problematic because Nietzsche believes that we can have values of which we are unaware. Katsafanis formulates his definition in terms of not disapproving of an affect, rather than regarding it as justified, in order to avoid the charge of over-intellectualization. However, the charge can also be avoided by noting that we value the aims of drives that can generate strong affective orientations by default, whether or not we become aware of them. Thus, on my account, in order to value something, an agent need not reflect on the justificatory status of their affects. While this helps to deal with the over-intellectualization problem, it has the unintuitive result that the alcoholic who disapproves of their alcoholism still values the activity of drinking alcohol in virtue of having a positive affective orientation toward it. Why Nietzsche would think this makes more sense when one looks at the way he often talks of valuations rather than values. Although Nietzsche uses the terms interchangeably, the technical term valuation helps convey the specific and perhaps unintuitive way in which Nietzsche talks about value and valuing. Nietzsche often describes valuations as symptoms of unconscious drive states. They are not something we can freely choose to have or not have. In this sense, what we value, that is, what we have positive valuations toward, is to a large degree not up to us. What we value in this sense depends on what Nietzsche calls our, quote, conditions of life. According to Nietzsche, quote, a person's valuations reveal something about the structure of his soul and what the soul sees as its conditions of life, its genuine needs. Thus, the alcoholic's positive affective orientation toward drinking alcohol, their valuation of it, reveals the structure of their soul by indicating that drinking alcohol is one of their conditions of life. Nietzsche talks this way about conscious moral judgments as well. For example, he claims, quote, our moral judgments and evaluations, too, are only images and fantasies based on a physiological process unknown to us. He often suggests that all our values can be traced back to some physiological source. In order to understand values, he suggests that we need to approach them as symptoms from an almost medical perspective. Disapproving of a symptom does not make it go away, and we experience positive valuations of the aims of our drives, which is just what Nietzsche often has in mind when he says that we value something, whether we like it or not. In this sense, what I have called our valuings, and what Nietzsche calls our valuations, are just positive affective orientations toward a drive's aim. We can feel conflicted about our values when our drives conflict with one another, as in the case of the alcoholic. But this conflict does not stop either drive from issuing and evaluating unless one drive wins out and the opposing drive is unable to generate a strong pro-attitude. The second implication is that we do not automatically value the aims of all of our drives. The bare fact that I have a drive for aggression or knowledge does not imply that I value either of these things. These drives must be able to generate positive affective orientations for me to count as valuing their aims. This addresses the problem 𝗖𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗲𝗀 identifies in Richardson's account, namely, that not every goal toward which we are disposed counts as a value. If the alcoholic's drive to drink is suppressed by a stronger disposition, so that their drive to drink cannot generate a positive affective orientation toward its aim, then the alcoholic would no longer value drinking. Drinking alcohol would no longer be one of their conditions of life. In this scenario, the drive to drink has not disappeared altogether, rather it is unable to generate a pro-attitude toward its aim, and so it cannot issue in a valuing. To conclude, my competing account captures the Nietzschean thought that we can feel conflicted about our values, and it addresses the two problems that 𝗖𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗲𝗀 identifies in Richardson's account and Clark and Dudrick's account. First, unlike Richardson's account, my account does not imply that we value the aims of all of our drives, only the aims of our drives that can generate strong affective orientations. And second, unlike Clark and Dudrick's, it does not require that we reflect on the justificatory status of our values, and so it allows us to have values of which we are unaware. Thank you for listening.